you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for showing up so far and the people who are yet to do so. This event is sponsored by the Science Fiction Association of Bergen County, which runs over a dozen book groups, movie nights, television gatherings, astronomy programs, and other events each month. One of our activities is our special activity where we will take in a reading, a signing, a talk, some other presentation having to do in some way with science fiction, fantasy, horror, science, and related areas. So that's what we're doing tonight. For anyone who is outside of our circle, you have my email address and my Facebook address so that you can contact me for more information. Otherwise, and I will also be sending you some information, whether you want it or not. So tonight, Paul is going to be speaking to us about, this evolved out of we have a couple of movie events, and we were talking about possibly having him down again to lead a discussion on some particular aspect of science fiction filmmaking, and it kind of evolved into this. So while I'm going to be leaving the media end of things to Paul, which is specifically the TV and science and movies, there were a couple of related aspects that I wanted to talk about. Also, we wanted to mention that people in academia are like kind of used to people being very solemn and students sitting on their hands and not paying any attention, catching some sleep. In our science fiction group, we're a much more rowdy and rambunctious crowd. So people will probably be interrupting Paul with questions as he's speaking or right after he speaks. Also, if you've not done so, please do open your chat. That allows you to be more polite, and also if you need to put in a link for something that you wanted to mention, it allows you to do so and everyone will be able to see it. Okay, so a couple of comments I wanted to make before Paul actually starts. The topic is alternate realities, which ties in with the multiverse, parallel worlds, the many worlds theories, and so on. Thought-wise, this goes back at least to ancient Greece. I mean, if you really look at Plato's The Cave, if we're in a cave seeing imperfect shadows of the true world, well, then you, by definition, have a minimum of two different worlds, let alone other people who might be in other caves. More recently, moving this out of the area of speculation and more into the modern theoretical physics and quantum realities theories. The most important name is probably Hugh Everett III. About 75 years ago, he proposed some mathematical equations that would put the discussion on some sort of more of a mathematical scientific thing where you could talk and have a certain degree of commonality as opposed to just people talking past each other in the wind. This terminology and ideas gained a lot more mainstream acceptance in the past few years, mostly because of the efforts of cosmologist Brian Greene, who has talked extensively about the multiple worlds theory. Once again, this is not a science group. We're not going to get deep into the thicket of it. A, because I'm not qualified, and B, because Brian Greene alone has 9 different types of parallel universes that he has come up with as being theoretical possibilities. Finally, looking at some of the written works of science fiction that have gotten into this concept before movies and TV really had the budgets and some of the other paraphernalia to explore this in more detail. Certainly some of the people we should talk about would be Roger Zelazny and his Amber books, in which Amber is the true reality, like Plato's, and our world and all of the other worlds of the multiverse are just imperfect reflections of that. All of the idea of alternate histories, where if Germany had won World War II, if the South had won had won the Civil War, etc., are all variations on that. And finally, the last thing I'm going to mention before turning it over to Paul is the classic Larry Niven story, All the Myriad Ways, which is just a wonderful rumination on how this may play out in our universe. So Paul is, so we're turning it over to Paul Levinson. You may know him as a university professor, as a popular culture commentator, as a science fiction writer, as a past president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. He wears many other hats for his many other heads. So I'm going to be turning it over to Paul. Take it away, Paul.
All right, well, thanks. Actually, as you can see in this video, the main reason I wear a lot of hats is I don't have that much hair anymore. So I'm trying my best to disguise that. But I'm actually really delighted to be able to talk to you about alternate histories, because I've really, especially in the last few years, come to treasure them, and both in the written form, which Phil has mentioned some of the important works, but truthfully, even more so on in movies and television series. And apropos of the COVID lockdown, but even before the COVID lockdown, I think one of the best media developments in the history of media, and more particularly in the history of television, has been Netflix and Prime Video and Hulu and all of those sites that allow you to see basically a whole season of a series at the pace that you want to see each episode. That to me is really the equivalent of reading a book, where you decide, is it just going to be chapter 1 or chapter 1, 2, and 3, or maybe you'll go crazy and stay up all night and read 10 chapters. That really gives the imagination and the mind its freest rein. So in the first place, how did I come to get so interested in alternate history? Those of you who know me, like, for example, Marty mentioned before we actually started doing this, that we first met when I was either reading from or talking about one of my time travel novels, The Plot to Save Socrates. Well, time travel, which I've always loved and has always been my favorite form of science fiction, although alternate histories are coming close to that. But if you think about it, there is a natural connection between time travel and alternate history, because if you travel back to the past and you change something, well, obviously, history is going to change. And, we've all heard of the butterfly effect, which I suppose is scientifically true. Those are fun to think about, these little unintentional things that you do, like you're sitting in a restaurant and you accidentally knock over a glass of water in your trip to the past, and that causes a waiter or a waitress to rush over to your table, and they therefore don't pay attention to what's going on at another table, and because of that, history has changed. Those are fun. But to me, even more fun are the changes in history that happen when someone goes back in time and deliberately tries to change something. And here we have, the old chestnuts of science fiction, which I began, reading in the 1950s. In the early days, it was someone was trying to go back to 1865 and stop the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Then we began getting stories after the assassination of JFK, somebody going back in time and trying to stop that as well. And there are always two ways you can, as a science fiction writer, handle those scenarios. One way is, and this way actually in some ways is more fun, at least to write, but probably in the long run is less fun to read and think about. In this first way, you go back and you either fail to change the history, or even more ironic and fun is your attempt to stop a terrible event, in fact, is one of the main things, if not the main thing, that makes it happen. Right, Bring the Jubilee does come to mind. But the other, which in general is more fun, is you go back in history to change something and you do change it. And this is really where alternate histories have most arisen from. And I could talk about alternate histories all night. In fact, I could easily teach a course on it. I could probably talk at a university, maybe not Fordham University, but who knows, into offering a degree in alternate history work, because there's so much of it. But obviously, we don't have that much time tonight. So instead, what I'm going to do is just talk to you about a bunch of alternate history stories that have been on either a television screen or a movie screen, or in most cases, both. If it's a movie, it shows up sooner or later on television. And let's start with a nice, unhappy topic, Adolf Hitler. And I don't know, I haven't really done a count of this, and there are probably stories out there and even movies and possibly even television shows that I don't even know about, which involve either an alternate history in which Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were successful in the Second World War, or if they weren't successful, Hitler somehow survived and is still up to some no good somewhere. And again, I'm sure there are more than the movies and television shows that I'll mention here, but I do want to talk briefly about a handful that I've put aside, watched, very much enjoyed, in no particular order of importance. They would be The Man in the High Castle, which I will say, in my opinion, is the best thing ever to have been on Amazon Prime as a television series, and for that matter, on any streaming service. While we're on Amazon Prime, Hunters, there were 2 seasons of that on Amazon Prime. The Plot Against America, which now I'm not sure if it was on Amazon Prime or was it HBO? Yes. Okay, thank you. Good. And I'll just also throw in there Fatherland, which was a 19. It was a novel by Robert Harris in 1992. It was made into a movie starring Rutger Hauer in 1994. And obviously, The Plot Against America was based on a novel by Philip Roth. Hunters, as far as I know, is not based on anything. It was written for the television series. The Man in the High Castle, I don't have to tell you, was based on Philip K. Dick's, I think, 1962 novel. It won the Hugo Award. I would say, and I think most people who have read it would say, it's one of the best science fiction novels ever written, although I did have some problems with it, and also therefore with the series, but really a masterpiece. And that, of course, as I just said, was made into a superb series on Amazon Prime. Let me also mention that we are recording this, and I'll be putting the recording up on my YouTube channel. And in this recording, I'm going to put a link to the interview I was fortunate enough to do with Rufus Sewell, who starred as John Smith in The Man in the High Castle on Amazon, a very, very important character for a variety of reasons. I'll just mention 2 of them. One, he was not in Philip K. Dick's novel, so he's a character who was created for the TV series. And 2, he was a very pivotal, important, indeed the central character in that television series. But let me start, if I had to choose of those 4, and they're all really excellent, what perhaps is the weakest of the 4? I mean, that's really tough, but I would say it's pretty much a tie between Fatherland and The Plot Against America. By the way, what got me interested in Fatherland, it just goes to show you that advertising can be so important. The poster, the ads for the book, Fatherland, showed a scene, obviously in Germany, with some people walking down the street, and there's a poster in back of them, and it says Das Beatles, and it's clear that it's, there are Nazi signs there as well. And there you have, just in that image, a great capturing of the alternate reality. And by the way, what makes, I think, alternate realities really good is not just how they are different from our reality, but how you can find elements of our reality in the alternate reality. And on that point, I just want to say, it's a somewhat obvious, but I think sometimes overlooked point. Movies and television are better at showing you that than written words on a page, because you see it with your own eyes. So that poster was just a poster for a book. But again, I ran out and bought the book as soon as I saw that poster, because I knew it was going to be a good story. So it is a very good story. One of the things I always look for in alternate history is that it all explained how and why history diverged. In the case of Fatherland, the point of divergence is the Normandy invasion did not succeed. So Eisenhower resigns in disgrace, poor Ike, and the Germans win the Second World War. The United States continues fighting with Japan, and we do, because we drop atom bombs on Japan in this alternate reality, do force Japan into surrendering. But that's the setup for that story. I highly recommend both the book and the movie. And if you don't have time to read the book, the movie is a pretty accurate portrayal of what was in the book. The Plot Against America, of course, Philip Roth is an otherwise famous author, and he didn't need to write this book. He already was famous enough. But it's a very good book, and in this book, the difference in the reality happens earlier than the Normandy invasion. And in the book and in the television series, it takes place almost entirely, if not entirely, in the United States. And the key turning point here is that Lindbergh, who was a Nazi sympathizer in our reality and was very popular because he had flew across the Atlantic, first solo flight, all those things. And unsurprisingly, in our reality, he never got much further than that, or rather surprisingly, he never got much further than that. But unsurprisingly, in the alternate history, he's elected president. And as a Nazi sympathizer, this changes everything in the United States. And this is a really wonderful story. It shows what a Jewish family living in Newark are going through with a Nazi sympathizer in the White House. And not to go too much off base, but I can't help but saying, we may have come close to that with the election of Donald Trump, who became president in 2017. Not that Trump, is or was an ipso facto Nazi, but he certainly seems to have a lot of fascist tendencies, his disrespect for the truth, his attitude that if you don't like what I say, I'll enforce what I'm saying by military force, his response to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, calling out the National Guard. So I'm sure it's going to make some people who at least watch the video upset and angry, to which I'll point out, good. Actually, Nick is asking a good question. Did the Lindbergh baby kidnapping happen in the Plot Against America? I don't think so. But I could be wrong about that. It certainly wasn't in the movie, I think, but I could be wrong about that. That's a good question. Now that I think about it, that would be a good thing to keep in that alternate history, because that certainly brought Lindbergh and his family a lot of sympathy. But I can't quite recall. whether it was in the movie or the book for that matter. Hunters is a very interesting work. As I said, of the 4 Hitler alternate history stories I mentioned, Hunter is the only one that's not based on a previously best-selling or brilliantly lauded book. I don't know if The Man in the High Castle was a best-selling book in 1962. It was certainly lauded, and to the point of winning the Hugo Award for that year. But it's a wild story. It has a wicked twist at the. It's 2 seasons. It has a wicked twist at the end of the first season, which I'm not going to tell you about because I don't want to spoil that for you. But what it involves is a group of Americans who are Nazi hunters. They're the hunters, and a little bit of it is over the top. But the alternate history in that story is that Hitler somehow did escape. The whole scene of that we accept as history, which I assume is true, that he committed suicide in the bunker as the Allies were closing in, that was just a fake news story that was put out and that enabled Hitler and Eva Braun to escape to Argentina. And I thought that was done very well. The acting in that is just brilliant. Al Pacino plays one of the main roles, and I would say that's one of the best alternate history stories I've seen on television. I see Nick mentions Watchmen. Yes, I'm going to talk about that as well in a minute or two. But I do want to go ahead. Question here.
Yeah, I'm surprised that in the Nazi/Hitler, you're not mentioning Inglourious Bastards.
Oh, yes. Well, that's a good movie. Yeah, I really should mention that. I was going to make brief reference to it when I talked about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is Quentin Tarantino's other, alternate history story. But yes, that's worth mentioning, although honestly, I don't think that's as profound as the 4 television series or movies I mentioned. And in a way, it's in the same, I would say, category as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Quentin Tarantino, I think, is a brilliant filmmaker, but he is not someone who is interested in exploring the philosophical issues of alternate history. So, but yes, you're completely right about that. Let me just say a few things about The Man in the High Castle. I said before that one of the joys of seeing alternate history on a screen is seeing the alternate history right there. And one of the most interesting things to me, especially being someone who investigates as many aspects of media as I can, and in this case, this has to do with the advertising. And I don't know how many of you remember when the first season was rolling out on Amazon, they thought it would be a great idea to launch a massive campaign, including in New York City, where they put ads for The Man in the High Castle in the New York City subway system with big swastikas on them. And people riding the subways, they, I guess, were not fans of science fiction. They hadn't read Philip K. Dick's novel in the first place. All they saw were Nazi swastikas in the subways, a pretty upsetting thing. So it was a brilliant advertising campaign, but it shows you right there, when you're dealing with alternate histories, it's hard to advertise the alternate history in a way that doesn't offend people when the alternate history is that the Nazis won World War II and you're showing them in such ascendance in the United States. But I will say the film the filmic quality of the television series was absolutely superb, and even the introduction of each of the episodes, you hear Edelweiss in the background, and you see the American, ships getting shot down, and you see the Nazi and Japanese insignias taking over the country, was really one of the most effective introductions I've ever seen. And while we're on those kinds of details, one of the seasons opens up with a scene on Long Island where John Smith and his family live, and John Smith's son is going to school. And what that scene is trying to show you again is this combination of how normal and recognizable suburban life is under the Nazis, but how different it is. And just to make that even more believable, they chose some brilliant background music. I think it was Paul Anka's My Hometown. I took a down in my hometown. So you see basically John Smith's son walking into school, looking at the girls, they look at him, you hear all this music. This could have been, a scene out of, Rock Around the Clock or some real movie about music made in the 1950s. Yet, of course, John Smith's son is the son of John Smith, who is the American who has completely sold out to the Nazis as a way of surviving and keeping his family alive. I will say one thing, and again, anyone who's interested should watch the interview I did with Rufus Sewell. One thing I did not like about the series on television, and again, Smith was not a character in the novel, so this doesn't apply to the novel, was they do try in the series to show how Smith is beginning to not be happy with the orders he's getting from Berlin, and his American history is beginning to become more important to him. And that becomes especially important when this son that I just told you about, he has some illness, and according, to the rigorous Nazi code, the son has to be put to death as an undesirable. And Smith, refuses to do that and instead kills the doctor. But unfortunately, in the final season, which was produced by not the original showrunner. The original showrunner was Frank Spotnitz, and for whatever reason, which Rufus Sewell didn't want to go into, and I can't tell you, I don't really know any more about that, he left the show and a new showrunner came in and basically totally moved the Smith character in a different direction. So I think that's an interesting thing to look about. I do want to say one other thing about The Man in the High Castle. This is just a personal issue with me. The one thing that I didn't like in either the novel or the series was the central role that I Ching had in terms of people from one reality being able to communicate with people in other realities. Why didn't I like it? Well, as Oz Fontecchio will remember, when I used to come down to PhilCon, I'm a purist when it comes to science fiction. It's not that I don't like fantasy. I love Lord of the Rings, but I don't usually like, including in this case, the mix of fantasy and science fiction, because it weakens the science fictional aspects of it. And what I did like in the television series is how they show that the Nazis were figuring out ways of, in effect, teleporting people from one reality to another. That I thought was far better and more realistic, and to me more convincing than, look, maybe it's just me, I don't really know what I Ching is, and maybe some viewer will tell me. I mean, I can read what it is, but I can't tell for the life of me how I could use that to communicate to an alternate reality. All right, let me mention some other shows which I think are really, really important. And I would say one of the best all-time alternate histories, and this does not have a print origin, is something that was and is being done by Ronald D. Moore. And of course, he has a whole history in science fiction on the screen. In fact, in addition to the history, he currently is still the showrunner of Outlander, which is an interesting time travel story. But what I'm talking about is For All Mankind. And, those of you who know me pretty well know I don't know if you know, I like to say that I am. I'm a cheapskate. I don't like to spend money where I don't have to. And so the only reason, I don't know what I would have done, but it just so happened that I bought an Apple computer right around the time when Apple TV Plus was starting. And when you buy an Apple product, they give you a year's free TV. So when I saw that For All Mankind was going to be on Apple TV Plus, I said, great, I'll see it for free. But I liked that show so much that I have to admit, after the year was up, I've been paying for my subscription ever since. And the story of For All Mankind, without giving too much away, the alternate history divergence, is that right before we, in July 1969, get the first people to the moon, the Soviets, a few months before, they get there first. And they'll completely explain why. And by the way, I do want to mention, and I just want to give a brief shout out to a great book. And I often talk about this book. This is probably the best science fiction novel that you never heard of. And I often ask my audience, would you like to hear about the best science fiction novel that you never heard of? And no, it's not one of mine. But this is a novel that this title has been used by at least half a dozen different other novels, but this is a novel called Red Moon, written by David S. Michael and Daniel Brenton. And it basically goes into what happened in Russia in the 1960s, why they didn't succeed in getting to the moon first. And, if you think about just in real history, it's always fascinated me, right? They had Sputnik, they had Sputnik 2, they got a dog up there, Laika, right? Unfortunately, they didn't care enough about poor Laika to get her back, so she sort of, that was her last stand in space, but they did get Yuri Gagarin up there, they got him back. They were really going great guns, and then they fell apart. Most people think it's because of the death of Sergei Korolev, I think his name is, who was the man behind the Soviet space program. I don't really know what the reason is, but this novel goes into those reasons, and it's a great novel. Anyway, that novel is called Red Moon. For All Mankind uses the setup that the Soviets did get there. And then it's been on, a few seasons. I think it's been on 3 seasons, and the 4th season will be on next year. I think really it's a brilliant storytelling, brilliant television. Again, it mixes in like some real things and, real people in slightly different ways. Like somehow because of the change in the space program, Chappaquiddick doesn't happen. So Ted Kennedy is elected president. That happens early on. And all sorts of other delightful things. And, I highly recommend that. It's fun to watch just to see those little things from our reality that pop up in different ways in For All Mankind. And I would say because of that, in addition to Outlander and the early stuff that Ronald D. Moore did, which, the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, that's his other brilliant work, a million times better, I think, than the original Battlestar Galactica. I think Ronald D. Moore has already established himself as one of the top 2 or 3 makers of science fiction for the screen. Nick mentioned Watchmen. That also is alternate history. and again, the reason why I'm not like just totally thrilled with it is, to be honest with you, and again, I'm sure I'll get like a lot of boos from who's ever watching this. In general, superhero stories, they're okay, but they verge to me on fantasy. And I mean, forgetting even about Watchmen for a second, you know, Superman, Batman, okay, they're interesting. They don't have the strengths that I think science fiction has. Actually, Superman is closer to science fiction than something like Watchmen, where there's a whole bunch, there's a pantheon of, you know, superhero kinds of people. It's a very powerful story, however, and to be honest with you, I didn't read the comics, but I did see the television series, which I think was on for just 1 year, one season. It wasn't renewed. It connects to the Tulsa Massacre, which happened in 1921, one of the worst events in American history. And unfortunately, we still haven't gotten that much better, where these rednecks in Oklahoma just burned down what was known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa. African-American people who built up a very vibrant, powerful, successful financial center there in the West or Midwest, wherever exactly Oklahoma is, and the rednecks couldn't stand that, and so they expressed their outrage by burning it down, but so that's what is the basis of what we see in Watchmen, and there are, you know, some nice divergences of into alternate history there. But I do want to say that, again, because there are superheroes involved, to me, the impact is weakened. I would have rather seen the same kind of story with human beings, you know, with the powers that we as human beings have, and see how that played out. But then again, it's always easy for someone to criticize something, and you know, they put a lot of work into that show. Let's go back to Quentin Tarantino, Inglourious Bastards, indeed. But I think I mean, I like both those movies, but Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I really like that because I guess when I saw Inglourious Bastards, I knew there was going to be alternate history in there. When I saw Once Upon a Time in History, I didn't know that there was going to be alternate history there. And I won't say what the change is, but basically the whole thing plays out as if and it does happen back in Los Angeles in the build up to the Sharon Tate murders, which of course we all know, you know, when that happened, and, you know, Charles Manson, and, you know, taking the Beatles, Paul McCartney's Helter Skelter seriously. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood comes up with a great alternate history twist, and it's very good because another thing about these kinds of twists is I think it's always the most effective when, after you see the twist, you can see the groundwork for the twist in some earlier bits of the story. So I highly recommend that.
By the way, Paul.
Yeah.
You just have to be careful when you're saying, of course, we all know about Sharon, you know, Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
We have a mostly, you know, you and the people in our audience are baby boomers, but I suspect that there are a lot of college-age people who, you know, it's not part of their consciousness. So, you know, we of a certain generation always have to keep in mind that people who are 20, 40, whatever years younger than us have different reference points, and that you know, mentioning something like that, of course, there is a whole big audience that is not part of their collective framework.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, so I'll say briefly for anyone who's listening, I mean, you can look up just Sharon Tate on Google and Charles Manson. Sharon Tate was, she was a young beginning to become a Hollywood star. And Charles Manson was was a ne'er-do-well who imagined himself, a great songwriter. And he listened to and loved the Beatles. And he apparently was motivated by Helter Skelter, although there's nothing about murder in that song. So who knows what went on in his mind. And he lived on a commune, and he had a lot of people living on the commune. He basically encouraged these people. I don't think he actually did the murders, but to attack the place where Sharon Tate and several other people lived, and they were murdered. And Manson, even though he didn't take part in the murder because he organized and inspired the murder, was found guilty and spent the rest of his life in prison. And I have to tell you, every single time he came up for parole, I was worried that they were going to parole him. And fortunately, they didn't. So one of the uglier times in history. Let me just mention one other thing before I talk about three other things very, very quickly. There is a show currently on, I guess it's HBO and HBO Max, The Last of Us, which I highly recommend. Now, let me just say, I am so sick and tired of post-apocalyptic plague stories. I did watch some of The Walking Dead. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped watching it. I watched Fear the Walking Dead, same thing. Frankly, it's nauseating. And so, I've had more than enough of that. There was a very good series, just one season, that came on maybe 2 years ago, Station 11. That was a good post-apocalyptic, the world was wiped out by a pandemic. So The Last of Us is in that genre, but like Station 11, it's very, very good. And first of all, why am I including it as alternate history? It's because the pandemic happens, I don't know, about 15 or whatever years ago, 18 years ago. 20 years ago, thanks. And and then everything changes. So in a way, that's an event that changes, in this case, the history of the world, although so far we've seen, this only in America. But I highly recommend that series. There are episodes that are almost so good they could be standalone movies. So there was an episode with two characters, Bill and Frank, who are living, basically surviving in an age in which just about everyone else is dead, taking care of each other. And it was a really beautiful, poignant episode. And then just this past week, they had a great episode that took place in Kansas City. The star, there are two stars. I think Pedro Pascal plays the main man star, and
Joel.
then what was that?
Joel.
Right, that's right. And then Ellie is the girl. What's the name? Who is the actress who plays Ellie? Well, she's good. She's like a young teen, like maybe 12, 13-year-old girl, I guess, or 11. She's really excellent. So just as there's like very, very good interaction between the two.
Or Ramsey.
Right. Thank you. Belle Ramsey. Right. And so that's, I think, an alternate history. Let me just mention a few other things, and then let me open this up to questions. And you might have a favorite, show, and I'd be happy to talk about that. One thing which I saw an ad for this last week, and I don't know that much about it, and I'm not even sure if it's opened or not, but this is not a movie or a television show. It's a play. It's a Broadway play. And the title of the play is And Juliet. Okay. And the play and Juliet is the Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. And believe it or not, I mean, this isn't a true history, because this is like an alternate fiction, I guess, because it basically is the story of Romeo and Juliet, but Juliet survives. Right. So, and we see, and I haven't seen the play, so I don't know exactly what happened to Romeo, why Juliet survived, but I'm applauding it here in this little talk as an example. Good for Broadway for putting on, in effect, this alternate history story, even though obviously Romeo and Juliet is not real alternate history. Because Juliet isn't real alternate history, because Romeo and Juliet is not real history, but it has the same structure of alternate history. And let me conclude, with, and again, those of you who know me well or hardly know me at all won't be surprised to hear this, a plug for something that I'm working on right now.
I'm shocked.
Yeah,
Shocked.
shocked. I can't believe it. But actually, and this actually could be made into a movie at some point. It's being shopped around at this point. But I wrote this story that was published over a year ago called It's Real Life. And basically, to give you just the background of the story, I've always been a fan of the Beatles. And like all fans of the Beatles, I was heartbroken when John Lennon was killed. And because of that, when the Beatles in Our Reality came out in the 1990s with the last, in effect, Beatle records, on one side, Free as a Bird, on the other side, Real Love. And I remember, when the first time I heard it, but especially Real Love, which I always liked more than Free as a Bird, it was heartbreaking to me. And I remember reading an interview where Ringo said, wow, it was like John was here and he just went out to get a cup of tea, and then we put in the other tracks. And to this very day, whenever I hear that song, it tugs at my heart. And so as a writer, when something affects me that much, usually sooner or later, I'm going to put those feelings into words. And, one of the things that I discovered was that the original title of that song was Real Life. Lennon later changed it to Real Love. And by the way, what happened is there were 3 demos that Yoko Ono gave to Paul McCartney years after John had died, and said, hey, you might want to record this with the Beatles. John would have wanted that. And the Beatles did record, the surviving Beatles did record. And by then it was called Real Love and Free as a Bird. They didn't record the third, which I think is called either Now and Then or Then and Now. I can never remember the title, because George Harrison didn't like it. So too bad Harrison didn't like it, because then we would have had 3 Beatles songs. But so what I decided to do, there was a disc jockey, this is real history, at Fordham University. His name was Pete Fornatel. Some of you may or may not have heard of him. He actually started as a student at Fordham University. He had a show called Mixed Bag in the 1960s. He then went to WNEW-FM. He was one of their major disc jockeys. I got to know him pretty well because I began teaching at Fordham University in the late 90s. And right around that time, Pete Fornatel came back to Fordham University and was a disc jockey on WFUV-FM. I actually, years earlier, when I first started teaching at Fairleigh Dickinson University, I ordered one of his books. I assigned it to one of my classes. It was called Radio in an Age of Television. And if you think about that title, you can tell it's written by a media savvy person, right? Radio in an Age of Television. He's aware of media evolution and the impact that has on media. So I knew Pete Fornatel. I will also say I always had like a warm feeling about him because he played one of a song that I wrote and recorded about another disc jockey, Murray the K's Back in Town. For those of you who grew up in the New York area, you may have heard, it's Murray the K on the swinging soiree. Anyway, so I actually wrote a song and recorded it, and Pete played it. He did a segue on DJs. So, and the last time I saw him was actually at a conference that Lance Straight organized on the 100th anniversary of Marshall McLuhan's birth, and this was in 2011. And so Pete was on the program and I was on the program. And unfortunately, he passed away a year or two later. way too young. So I put all these feelings into this story that I call It's Real Life, and it's an alternate history in which Pete, every time he plays a song, which in his reality is It's Real Life, he feels like a tug in his heart. He feels like this inchoate dread that there's something about this song, that something is going to happen to John Lennon, but he's not sure. And he takes a ride downtown on the train, and I won't say anything more about the story. When he gets off at Grand Central Station, he finds that he's in another reality, and that's in fact our reality. And then there's a whole story that ensues. So what's currently happening with that, I just want to mention an old friend of mine, Vinny TC, who actually was a student of mine years ago in the MA in Media Studies program at the New School. This is one of the reasons why it's good to be a professor. If your students like your courses and they go on, to do things, they're always kindly disposed to you. So he actually is in the final stages of making a radio play so it'll be an alternate history radio play. And there we have several surprises in the play, including some musical numbers. So that should be out up in the next month or so. And I'll send a note out to the group to let people know what when that's up and what the URL is. And I've expanded it into a novel, and it's currently in the very early stages of being considered possibly to be made into a movie. So that's way in the future. But if and when that happens, I will certainly put in links to this event so people will realize I was talking about this and inspired by all of you to talk about it. Very last thing I want to say is I did discover after I wrote this story that a science fiction writer by the name of Ian McLeod wrote a story back in, let me see, I think I'm just looking, 1991. I'm sure he wrote a story called Snodgrass, and it's an alternate history story also about John Lennon. And isn't this a great setup? In this story, back in 1962, John Lennon quits the Beatles because he loses an argument. John Lennon wants the Beatles to record Love Me Do as their first song, which of course in our reality they do. But they're pressuring the Beatles to record How Do You Do What You Do to Me. I think Herman's Hermits sang that song.
Jerry and the Pacemakers.
Jerry and the Pacemakers, good. You're right. That's right. Anyway, yeah, it's a good song, but not as good as Love Me Do. But so Lennon was right, but in this alternate reality, he quits the Beatles, and we find him in Birmingham in the UK in the 1990s, not happy by any means, but at least alive. And so I would recommend that story, which was also made into an episode for a British TV series called Playhouse. And I think you can see that on YouTube or online. So I highly recommend that as well. So with that, it's 8:26. Either I or someone else has been talking for almost an hour, and that's good. But let me turn this over now to you. If you have any questions, any alternate history stories you'd like to talk about. Okay,
Paul, I'd like to get your feedback on two things, both classics in different ways, both from Star Trek, the original series. One is the episode written by Harlan Ellison, although severely altered, The City at the Edge of Forever. For people that don't recall titles, that's the one where Kirk and company go back in time and meet Joan Collins, who is a pacifist movement which keeps America out of World War II until much later. And the other is, I believe, the longest running, albeit intermittent, alternate history in media, which is to say the Mirror Universe episode, which was, that's the Spock with the beard episode, people bad with titles, but that universe has been revisited in various other Star Trek series over the years. So I want to get your take on that, on either or both of those, Paul.
I'm more familiar with The City on the Edge of Forever. So let me talk a little bit or more about that. First of all, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that also is a time travel story, right? What happens is Kirk, Spock, and McCoy find a gatekeeper or whatever his name is, and they travel both back in time and to planet Earth before World War II. And yes, Joan Collins plays a character who is changing history as we know it. But it's impossible. Let me just say, one of the problems is when you have characters who come from one reality and they're changing history. And this was like changing history by, hundreds of years earlier, because the Star Trek characters are whatever is like 400 years into the future at that point. What's going to happen to them? They could just wink out of existence. I mean, that would be a major change if World War II was so dramatically different. So I thought that was unsurprisingly, even though it didn't have some of, and Harlan Ellison bitterly bemoaned every single, word that was not put into the Star Trek portrayal of that. In my opinion, it's one of the all-time most brilliant television episodes of both Star Trek and just of television. But let me mention, as long as you brought that up, and this is why I wanted to talk about that, I don't know how many of you here or how many of you watching the video have seen the Orville, which is basically a takeoff, not so much of Star Trek, the original series, but Star Trek, The Next Generation. And it is brilliant. And frankly, the first season I thought was funny, it was good, but it's gotten better and better. And in the third season, there is a character, and again, I don't want to give too much away, who also is thrust back in time and falls, and this is very similar in some ways and probably inspired by City on the Edge of Forever, falls in love with somebody in the past. But if this character stays in the past with this person, it's going to again change history, and chances are the Orville and the people on the Orville wouldn't even exist. And I just want to highly recommend that episode. It's in season 3. I don't have the number offhand. Frankly, I would recommend seeing all 3 seasons of the Orville, because it does build up, and it has its sometimes ridiculous, humorous elements, but on the other hand, it has some very profound elements. In addition to that, it also has fabulous music. There is yet another episode where 2 characters sing the Simon and Garfunkel song, "Flowers Never Bend with the Rainfall." So I continue to pretend my life will never end. It's a beautiful song, Simon and Garfunkel song. And in this imagined future, this music from the 60s is still very well known and liked. So yes, that whole nexus is very good. I do want to say that as far as time travel is concerned, as long as I'm on the topic, the Star Treks in general have done a really good time with time travel. Speaking of Star Trek, The Next Generation, and by the way, we're recording this on Wednesday, February 15th. Tomorrow, February 16th, 2023, is going to be the debut of the 3rd and final season of Star Trek Picard on Paramount Plus. I highly recommend that. But apropos of Picard and Star Trek, The Next Generation, there is a fabulous alternate history story called Yesterday's Enterprise in Star Trek The Next Generation, where, and I don't want to give too much away, but it has all the trimmings of an excellent alternate history. Yes, and Jason just mentioned that. Okay. I see there are a whole bunch of points that are made here. Yeah, Bill Dubie says R.I.P. Jerry Marsden. Actually, Jim, you had your hand though raised before.
Yes. I had to disagree with you about what you found interesting in Fatherland, because the idea that the Beatles could actually have existed in a Nazi Germany, in many ways, that started my own alt-hist career, because I read what Harris had done with that. And he's talking about 4 kids from a conquered country that probably would not have had art school, and were basing it on stuff that was part of the Degenerate Music Show in 1937. That threw me out right there. And one of my pet peeves is the idea that you can have an alt history where everything is different and the artists that we know would still create the same things we know, when in fact a lot of stuff could not be done because the creative process would not have allowed it to happen. There was a novel called Resurrection Day, where it happens 10 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis went hot. And you've got an English character who's saying that the Beatles had just released a new song called Penny Lane. And I'm sitting there going, no, they wouldn't have.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's basically where I was there. I was just fuming at that point. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's a fair fume. Because I think you make a very, very good point. And just in terms of, putting out and constructing the plot, Harris perhaps should have explained to us, readers in our world, how the Beatles could have done that. But look, if I'm not mistaken, in both the novel and the movie, first of all, in our reality, as we know, the Beatles in their early years spent some time in Hamburg. I think in the novel and the movie, that also happens. And so, and look, the Beatles
in the novel, there's just playing songs by them while the character is on his way to Switzerland in order to look up why it is that the mystery he's solving is taking place.
Okay, and in the movie,
I don't want to go into. I know we're trying to be spoiler free, but let's just say that if you're a student of history, you're going to see the solution way longer than this guy will.
Yeah. Well, okay, but I do think your point is valid, but again, I think there is a way out of that. Since the Beatles in our reality did spend some time in Germany, I could imagine the Beatles spent much more time in Germany, because in this alternate history, England is just a province of the greater Nazi Reich. And
rock?
What?
Yeah. Rock, would they've actually gotten that type of music together?
Well, okay, so your point then, is that rock in general and the Beatles in particular was so anti-establishment, even in our reality, that
two of them, Lennon and McCartney, could probably have been part of the Volkwerker program in order to bring them over, but whether they'd have studied music or not. If change would have happened before George was actually old enough, and Ringo might have died from pleurisy because they didn't give a damn about kids in hospitals in the conquered countries. So.
Okay, but then I'll just push back a little bit to say that the Germans, Joseph Goebbels in particular, fully understood the propagandistic and persuasive power of music. They weren't anti-music. No. So the key would have been, could they have gotten the Beatles, and they, by the way, they also understood the erotic impulse and how to use human feelings in a way to strengthen their hold. So, but I do think you raise an interesting point. And, I have a suggestion. Invite Mr. Harris here as a guest on a future event, Phil. And
we have a lot to talk about, Mr. Harris and I.
All right.
Okay, I wanted to touch on, toss out some other media which have not been talked about to give you a chance. And also I wanted to encourage the people that have not yet spoken up, but some other things that you might care to comment on or not would be the television series Sliders, which is about traveling to alternate worlds. There is a movie, but on this particular one, but also there's been lots of in general, there have been lots of Twilight Zone / Outer Limits / fill in the blank anthology that have depicted alternate worlds as episodes. There was a full-length motion picture of Ray Bradbury's classic time travel story, The Sound of Thunder, which resulted in alternate reality. A different take on that, not made into a movie, was, I think it was either R.A. Lafferty or maybe Robin Sheckley, Thus We Frustrate Charlemagne, in which people go back to change the past, succeed in doing so, but do not realize that they've done it. So different groups of people keep going back to change something that's already been changed until we eventually wrap back in the circle where the reality that we know comes into existence. Someone I saw in the chat put down that Fringe had episodes dealing with that.
Yeah.
And yes, there was a great episode of Red Dwarf, more than one with parallel realities, one in which sniveling coward Rimmer is actually Ace Rimmer, hero in another reality. They've done that more than once. So, and the last thing I'm going to mention about is not movies, but a series of books that were very popular, anthologies back in the 90s, I believe, possibly the 80s. But there was alternate Kennedys, alternate presidents, alternate generals, edited by Mike Resnick. There is for people that might not have seen it, because maybe you're not familiar with the science fiction genre, the cover art of alternate Kennedys in particular is just one of the great science fiction covers of all time. On that, Joe, Ted, and the other Kennedys, they became that universe's version of the Beatles, and the book cover is from the Meet the Kennedys album.
Yes.
Joseph Kennedy. Okay.
I love it.
So, okay, I would have had to run downstairs to grab my copy. Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to shut up now, let Paul or the other people give some more feedback.
Well, I want to hear what other people say. Let me just mention very, very briefly, because those are all great shows. I also love those alternate presidents and alternate whatever books that the unfortunately now late Mike Resnick edited. And just to expand that a little bit, as I think I mentioned, I started reading science fiction in the mid to late 1950s, so my golden age of science fiction was like everybody else, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and loved all those books. But I have to say, those alternate books obviously came out much later, and that coincided with not my initiation as a science fiction reader, but a science fiction writer. And just reading those stories, I just probably written only 1 or 2 stories then. Maybe I had my first story published in Analog or at Amazing Stories. But that to me really got me thinking about writing more time travel stories, alternate history stories, etc. And I will say this, I think that Mike Resnick is a still unacknowledged major player in the evolution of science fiction. And I would say this, if anybody is watching this, if you are a television producer, you ought to think about making a series just of the alternate presidents book. I mean, every story in that book is great. I also have to say, I watched every episode of Fringe. I thought it was brilliant. I thought that it did all kinds of things. And as I mentioned before, it's hard, I think, to mix comedy and I mentioned that regarding the Orville, comedy and science fiction, but Fringe, not that much of it was comedy, but it had these little touches. For example, the main scientist always says when people are coming into his lab, "I have a cow." because the guy didn't like just buying milk in the store, so he had a cow. That's how he got his milk. So just said here, it seems like a stupid thing, but that to me is like a courageous, funny little thing to put in a series. And I think Fringe, in its own way, is, even though it was obviously a series of continuing stories, is probably the closest successor to the Twilight Zone and even Outer Limits, because even though it had a continuing story, it often dealt with different elements, very different elements within that story. By the way, I should mention, apropos of Fringe, Anna Torv plays a major role in The Last of Us. So if you're an Anna Torv fan, she played the FBI agent in Fringe. She was great. And that was the first time most people, including me, saw her. She's every bit as good in The Last of Us. I can get to some of the questions here, or are there any other people who want to raise their hand and speak? Well, yeah, Mike Resnick loved the Beatles. I know that he did. That's right. The alternate president where Dewey wins. I listen, I'm going to give away the Dukakis wins, because again, that was written by Sheckley, who again was a master of humor and science fiction. So I'm going to spoil one story for you, but this will be an indication of how funny and excellent this anthology is. In that story, if I'm not mistaken, Dukakis wins, and he as soon as he gets to the White House, they begin telling him, we have like some aliens who we're keeping, underground. And he says, oh, I'd like to see them. And, so the whole story takes place, and he eventually goes through a series of underground tunnels and meets the aliens. And it turns out that Dukakis is an alien himself. That's like which is like, if you think about Michael Dukakis, it's, this is Sheckley's brilliant eye. I can believe that. Is Dukakis still alive, by the way? I'm not sure. But I don't mean to speak ill of the departed, but he did look and sound a little bit like an alien or an interstellar traveler. So yeah, that was a great story and a great book. I think someone said something about Eureka. Now, so Eureka is the series that there was a British version and an American version of it. Is that right? Am I confusing that with something else?
Eureka was about a town of scientists that were in the Pacific Northwest that were engaged in all sorts of advanced research. And for one episode, a number of the characters went back. When they came back, everything had been changed around them. And they actually went forward with that, made a soft reboot for the series.
Okay.
Actually happened on the British series Primeval as well, that one of them changed the past and one of the characters never existed.
That's really good. I'm just looking here at, I just want to see if there's any. Actually, Jim, tell me about the film Rosaline, because I've heard of it and I've never seen it. Tell us briefly what it's about.
Rosaline concentrates on a very minor character in Romeo and Juliet, who is the woman that Romeo was involved with before Juliet comes on the scene. And at points, she's trying to do her best to keep Romeo and Juliet from getting together, and in the process has her own set of adventures, and in order to try and get their way out of it, come up with a cover story that's actually closer to Shakespeare's play. Meanwhile, she ends up getting the better part of the deal, while Romeo and Juliet go off on their way and realize, yeah, I'm ready to do a walk of shame from you to each other. So
look, Shakespeare has been a great source, just not only in terms of his plays taken literally, but in takeoffs from his play and plays. For example, and this is not alternate history, but it's certainly like a take on Shakespeare, Kiss Me Kate by Cole Porter, which many people, including me, regard as his best music, and there's all kinds of funny stuff. Louise is saying, no, I'm sorry, Lewis is saying that Sharon Tate was pregnant and married to Roman Polanski. That's right. And that's sort of an oddity too, because Roman Polanski, he certainly made a movie about a vampire, and he often did those alternate movies. I can't recall though, what he was he already not in the United States when Sharon Tate was attacked? I know that he was shot. Yeah.
They were very much working in Hollywood. Sharon Tate would. His incident that forced him to leave was after he did Chinatown, which was about 1974, 75, about 5 years after the Tate murder.
Okay. Right. Yeah. And what's going on with him? I mean, not that this has much to do with what we're talking about. He at some point they said he could come back to the United States, and
they're in the process of trying to expunge his record, which there's a lot of contention going on about that. And meanwhile, there's it looks like he's facing charges in France for having forced himself on somebody a few years.
I see. Well, this is also an interesting thing, again, which is totally off topic, but I'll just throw it in because it is relevant to movie making and television making. And, it's something that, is becoming a prominent part of our culture with, people being canceled, so much. I hate to sound like a Republican, but I think actually it's like a broken clock is right twice a day. I think they are right to say there's a little bit too much canceling that goes on. And what I'm getting at is, what is a fan of an author, an actor, a recording artist supposed to do if you really love that person's work, but it turns out that person is like a despicable human being who has done bad things? Are you supposed to not love their work? I mean, getting back to Hitler, he was a painter, so I certainly wouldn't be interested in having any of Hitler's paintings in any place that I have any control over, but I would be interested in seeing what they look like, maybe get some insight, into them. So that does, with Polanski, that does raise that issue.
People who have not yet spoken, you also have the option, if you don't want to say something aloud and don't feel like putting it in your chat, you have the option of raising your hand. That's one of the, if you have your chat up, and your participants up, that's one of the things you can do, and we'll know that you want to say something. Paul, in the meantime, there are two pretty big movies that you haven't talked about, and one of them I can understand because it's a superhero movie, but I think still worth possibly mention, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which I know is not your bag, but also something that's gotten rave reviews. I'm butchering the title of it, but Everything Always All at Once has gotten rave reviews, deals with the multiverse. So I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about either of them.
Okay, I'll tell you the truth. I haven't seen everything about everything, whatever that is, because again, it's not that I don't like comedy, but what I only like comedy when it's deftly integrated into the story. The impression I had from what I read in terms of non-spoiler reviews and the overall description of that was, it was as much comedy as it is alternate realities. And so I'll probably watch it someday, but I didn't rush to see it. And what's the other one that you mentioned?
Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. It's comic books. I know you don't like that.
Yeah. Okay. Frankly, I haven't even heard of that, but that shows. Hey, maybe somebody can write an alternate reality story in which I did hear that, and I'm talking about that at great length in this. Thanks, Jim, for posting.
Everything All at Once is not a comedy.
Oh, it isn't. So I thought I heard that it was.
Maybe they in the trailers, but it's really an amazing film and visually amazing too. But it's not like you couldn't put Paul Rudd in it and make it into a success. It's really an amazing alternate universe film.
All right, well,
and well done. So I recommend it.
All right, you convinced me. So Phil, have me back here in a month and I'll talk about that movie. No, but okay, thanks, Bob. I respect your opinion. By the way, this is Bob Blechman, who even though he looks like about 100 years older than me, he was actually just 1 year ahead of me in the PhD program at New York University, the media ecology PhD program that was headed by Neil Postman. And so Bob and I got to know each other back then. And Bob has written a series of novels about Twitter, basically Twitter novels, and I highly recommend them. I think I was in a good mood, so I gave them some good blurbs. But there are all kinds of funny things and all kinds of good science fictional tropes, and I think you have some alternate reality woven in there as well in some places.
Yeah, I have time travel in the book as well. It's a mystery series, but it's got science fiction elements, and there's a lot of time travel going on.
Good. Who else has any questions here?
Oh, by the way, Paul,
Yes.
the first book of the series is called Executive Severance.
Right, Executive Severance. And so, by the way, they stole the title, or at least Severance, for the new television series, Severance, which actually is a superb series, has nothing to do with alternate history. By the way, I just want to briefly say this is an important point. I would say that if a series takes place in the present and it's a world that's very different from ours, but it doesn't pay any or maybe at most scant attention to how and why the world diverged, I would say that's not alternate history. In other words, I think for something to be alternate history, it has to be at least rooted enough in the past that, again, we can see the difference between that series of developments in the fiction and the reality in our world. Anyway, I would recommend Severance because it is an excellent series, has nothing to do with alternate history, but I would also recommend Executive Severance and the 2 sequels that Bob wrote. Who else has a book they'd like to mention in these closing minutes? If you don't mention it, then someday there's going to be an alternate history written where you had a great book that you didn't mention here, but it became a best-selling novel.
Well, I'll mention another series that I don't know if you know about, The Cross-Time Engineer.
Yes, is that one of yours, or is that just another?
No, it's a series by someone named, I think, Frankowitz, and it's literally alternate history because a Polish engineer in modern times gets drunk and stumbles into a time machine and ends up in, I think it's 12th century Poland, and basically changes all of history by uniting the Polish factions into a superpower, so that in the present time, when they get around to it, the lingua franca of the 20th century is Polish, not English.
I love that. See, and this is the key with alternate history. In our real history, there are many countries which came close to being world powers, but somehow something went slightly wrong. I mean, look, Spain was a world power, but when the British fleet just somehow managed to sink the Spanish Armada when it attacked Britain, even though Spain had already subjugated a large part of the world, England took over. So it's easy to imagine an alternate history in which the Spanish Armada won that battle, and we all now be speaking Spanish and all kinds of other things. But yes, Poland is a very interesting country. They had their moments. By the way, I don't know if anyone has written an alternate history story about this, possibly Robert Silverberg, but I think a great idea. So anyone who's watching, you can use this idea, although I might write it myself, is what would have happened if the Ottoman attack on Byzantium had failed and Constantinople had held and they had continued the Byzantine Empire totally into the modern world. That would be an interesting, different world also. So I just wanted to point that out. Jim, did you have a question or something?
I just put it in the chat. We're talking about foreign alt hist, and I wanted to recommend a series called The Last Empress, which was set in modern time, but in a world where the Korean Empire that was formed in 1895 was still with us. And it made some interesting observations about Korean society and about what the country would have been like had it not gone through much of what we saw today. And it was also a sort of backhanded way to try and do the Chuck and Die story a little bit, but still.
Yeah. Listen, I'll throw something else in here about Trump. I said at the time when Trump was elected, and I still feel that way now, that somehow we're living in an alternate history. It was somehow Trump, lost the popular vote, but I guess it happens all too often, but won the Electoral College and became president. And then all this surus, to use that Yiddish word, which means trouble, that's happened since then. This is basically, we are all participants in this alternate history story. Because frankly, if I were writing a novel in like 2010 or 2012 or 2014, and in that novel, I had Trump win the presidency in 2016, I don't know any editor who would have accepted that. They would have said, no, I'm sorry. Okay. And I would say, look, it's alternate history. They would have said, yeah, but it has to be plausible. So here we are.
That was a great punchline in Back to the Future when he's back in 1955 and says, Reagan is president.
Yes.
And they said, who's the Secretary of State, Jerry Lewis?
That was a brilliant line. Well, it's the same.
I wanted to mention some of the things that are in the comments just very briefly. Jim's the comments are flipping by faster and moving past my thing, but let's just see. Lewis mentions about the Kim Stanley Robinson's the years of rice and salt. Bill is mentioning about the movie Yesterday. Asking if Paul's seen it. Nick put in about Dark Matter, which our book group did last year as an alternate realities jumping back and forth book. So there, there's a lot of people that are putting in comments, but the people who are not seeing. The Simpsons predicted it. That's from Bill. I think that might be that. I think that might have been
Trump. That's wild. Let me just say to Bill, yes, I did see Yesterday, and I have to say, I thought it was a pretty good movie. It wasn't a great movie, but I like the movie more than I think most people like the movie. I don't know why people got so angry at that movie. I think just the idea that there could be a world in which no one had heard of the Beatles struck people as so preposterous, they just couldn't accept that as a plausible. But it wasn't great, but I thought it was pretty good.
There's a series and novel. I'm not sure it really qualifies as an alternate history so much as a cautionary tale, but we haven't talked about The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, okay, I want to tell you something about that. Who's the author of all those books?
Margaret Atwood.
Margaret Atwood, right. Okay. First of all, again, some of you know I was president of the Science Fiction Writers of America for like 3 years. And as I've said now several times, I'm very committed to science fiction as a genre. So one of the things that made me not feel good about all those stories, at some point early on, when The Handmaid's Tale was just a book, hadn't been made into a series, I think I was no longer president, but the Science Fiction Writers of America wanted to give Margaret Atwood an award, and she turned them down and said, I'm not a science fiction writer.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean anything. Again, with separating, you have to separate the person from the work. But I have to say, my wife, Tina, and I did sit down and we started watching, the first series, which I know has been lauded, the first season of that series. And
it's hard to watch.
Yeah, we frankly found it, too unpleasant. And Tina is a little more quick to do that. I have a greater tolerance for gore and unpleasant things than she does. But even I'm a pretty sensitive guy. So I have my limits, and I basically said, I don't feel like seeing any more of this. It's but on the other hand, look, I recognize that series has had enormous impact. And I guess it is an alternate history, although I haven't seen enough of it or read the books to because again, just something that's different from our reality. There has to be some element, I think, to show where the divergence took place, how it took place.
How did you get from here to there?
That's right.
There's some flashbacks that hint at it, but I don't think it's fully developed how we got from here to there.
Okay. Yeah.
Paul,
Well-
we're after 9 o'clock. Now, I personally do not have a problem with continuing on. I mean, I could listen to you talking almost as long as you could listen to you talking.
I
But
doubt it.
I also wanted to give you the option that, if you wanted to end it now, people have gotten their money's worth. We promised them an hour and a half with Paul. And so this is, if you want to go on, you can continue to go on. And if people who are in the audience really have to use the bathroom or something, it's okay for you to leave and not come back, because we said it was going to end at 9. But Paul, if you want to keep going, we'll keep, at least some of us will keep listening.
Well, let's do this, because I'm getting, pretty hungry and haven't eaten dinner.
Yes.
But if anybody has some question that they wanted to ask and somehow, or they asked it and we didn't look at it, certainly I have a couple of minutes to do that. But if everyone is totally satisfied that they got all their questions answered and they're really excited, I should mention, by the way, if you want to read that story, it's Real Love. Just search on it. It's Real Love, Paul Levinson. I put it up on a site called Vocal, VOCAL, where you can read it for free. And you'll also be able to see there the progress of the radio play, and there are going to be links to the radio play from there when it's published. So I just talked a couple more minutes about something very important. But if anybody has any other questions or any other thoughts they'd like to get out, I'll be happy to mention that. Otherwise, we'll do this again sometime. So
I also want to mention that people that do not know Paul and already have his email or Facebook, you all have mine, so you can contact Paul through me if you don't have any other way of doing so.
Yeah, let me also say, as long as we're here, just very, very quickly, I'm still on Twitter, but I'm no fan of Elon Musk, although I admire what he's done in space and I like his Tesla work, but I don't like what he's done on Twitter. But I'm still on Twitter because I'm a glutton for punishment. Actually, really, there's still a lot of people there. But I do want to mention two other sites where you'll find me. One is called Mastodon, spelled just like the prehistoric elephant. And the other is called Spoutable, spelled Spoutable, IBLE. Maybe it's ABLE. I'm not sure. I think it's IBLE. Anyway, both of those are Twitter-like systems. Mastodon has been in existence for a while. Spoutable just went up a couple of weeks ago. So you can find me there as well. And on Facebook as Paul Levinson. And I have a policy of just about following anyone, whoever follows me, because I still can't believe that anybody is following me. Okay, my pleasure. Jason Spoutable. Okay, thank you. It is IBLE. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Listen, this was a great pleasure seeing so many of you here. I really, really had a good time.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Paul. I still owe you a lunch from the presentation at the college.
You know what? That's why I'm so hungry. Because
how many years is it now?
Lunch. All right, I'm going to come up to upstate.
Robert, hello. Nice to meet you in the flesh, sort of.
Oh, this is almost as good. All right, take care, everyone. Thanks, Phil, again for inviting me.
We'll do it again, Paul. Maybe not this specific topic, but we'll do it. Great to see you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And I thank everyone in the audience for joining us. I'm going to be closing things down. Nice to meet those of you I hadn't met previously. And do remember, we do all kinds of things. Every month we have a science fiction or related writer or someone speaking in our group. And as I say, every so often we have Paul do so. So I'm going to shut things down. Have a great, and remember, you'll be able to re-watch this in the very near future when Paul has done some editing and putting it up on his YouTube channel.
Yeah, let me mention, I'm going to edit out anything that I even slightly disagree with, and then I'll put it up on YouTube, okay? All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, good night, all.